All right, so welcome everyone. Let's start sharp with some introductory words, although I see people are still dropping in, so welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Johanna Siliakus, and I work for the Transport Sector Office at the Asian Development Bank. We would like to warmly welcome you to this first session of our new webinar series on e-mobility, with our first session, Introduction to E-Mobility. This series is presented as part of the E-Mobility Support and Investment Platform for Asia and the Pacific, which is a platform operated by ADB and financed by the Global Environment Facility, GEF. So we will have some upcoming webinar sessions as part of the series. You'll see them on the screen here. And you will receive emails with information about each webinar. So if you want to join us, please register when you receive those emails. So in addition to the regular bi-weekly webinar sessions, which are presented here, we'll also have some other webinar sessions in between. So for next week, we have lined up a project presentation, and we'll have the GEF-funded e-mobility pilot from Indonesia presented on Wednesday, 27th of September, 3 p.m. Manila time, so the same time as now. I hope many of you can join that one as well. Here's a sneak peek of the session and also a QR code that you can use to register for this webinar. The aim of the e-mobility platform is to build capacities and to support scaling up of financing to e-mobility initiatives. And we aim to gather a community of e-mobility practitioners under the platform. So if you're listening to this webinar and have not yet expressed your interest to join the e-mobility community yet, you can do so by filling in a survey that will help us further develop activities under the platform. So at the end of the survey, there's a possibility to state interest in joining the e-mobility community, and that will ensure that you will receive updates on any upcoming e-mobility platform activities. So here you can see a QR code with a link to the survey on the screen now, right? So before introducing today's speaker, just very quickly a couple of words on house rules. So to ensure a smooth webinar session, all microphones are disabled. At the end of today's session, there will be some time for questions from the audience. So please send your questions through the Q&A function, which is available for you at the bottom of your screen. You can send us questions throughout the presentation. And also during the Q&A session, you may raise your hand to ask your questions and the moderators will bring you in. And please note that this webinar session is recorded and it will be posted on the platform's website when this has been launched. So now let me introduce our speaker for today's session, Konrad Richardson. Konrad is currently working as a senior international technical advisor for the ASEAN German project Sustainable Mobility in Metropolitan Regions, and he has past experience from organizations such as GIZ, World Bank, and ITDP. He's worked on a wide array of transport-related topics, including e-mobility, public and non-motorized transport, and intelligent transport systems. And this session's Q&A will be moderated by Tom Fleming from our implementing partner, Integrated Transport Planning. So, Konrad, we're very pleased to have you kick off this webinar series. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for the warm welcome. I will share my screen. I trust you can see my slide.
Yes.
Yes, excellent.
Thank you.
So a pleasure and an honor to get to speak to ADB representatives and others from all across Asia from the comfort of my living room. So thank you for joining us today. I am pleased to introduce you to this webinar series and to really introduce the e-mobility topic. And as you all know, mobility electrification is an ongoing worldwide revolution, and it's happening very fast, and it presents us with many challenges and opportunities. And one of these opportunities is decarbonization, which you know very well. But achieving this is not without its own challenges. And as I will present and argue towards, this might require us to rethink our current mobility policy and practices, especially in Asia. And through my talk, I will share some of the work I am doing, and I hope to put forward a case for greater consideration and investment in light electric mobility. And I'll primarily focus on urban mobility. Rural mobility electrification has its own opportunities and challenges. But when I say light electric vehicles, I refer to vehicles like you see here on screen, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and in some instances also four-wheelers, like the electrification of the jeepneys, which some of you may have seen or experienced in the Philippines. And these kinds of vehicles, they currently receive relatively less policy and project finance attention than what I will call heavy EVs, which really means private cars. And just to be clear, the electrification of public transport is also absolutely necessary. And above all, what we need to do is create more compact, transit-oriented and car-light cities. And much of the work I'm going to present today comes from my team and I, specifically from Joachim Bergerhoff, who leads this topic in our project. And my project is the ASEAN GIZ Summer Project. It's a sustainable mobility project in the ASEAN region, and we've been working closely with the ASEAN Secretariat to draft the ASEAN guidelines on light electric mobility. And I will share with you some of the early research today, and that will be published early in 2024. But we also support EV policy development in Cambodia and Laos, and we are currently setting up light electric vehicle pilot projects in 4 different cities in 4 different countries. The most mature project would be in Udon Thani in Thailand, where we will launch an electric tricycle before the end of the year. So if you represent any of the ASEAN countries, you're very welcome to reach out to us. Let's talk. We understand your challenges, and we already work very closely with many of you, as well as with ADB via CDIA. As for me, I've already been introduced, but I have worked in the public, private, and third sector on a variety of topics, and EV has really crept up on probably many of us. For me, it's been the last 3-4 years. I keep getting requests to do EV-related work, so it's become a very big focus of my job, and I've really had to learn by doing. And fortunately, I've worked in setting up EV businesses. I've worked from a governance perspective, and also doing a lot of capacity development in the more recent years on EV. And today, I will try to bring this all together in my presentation. And we will do so by first talking about the fundamentals of electrification. This might not be new information to many of you, but I do hope I can bring everyone to a sort of level playing ground, so each subsequent webinar is relevant and clear to everybody. So we'll talk about the fundamentals, then batteries. We'll also speak about charging, and I want to put forward what I consider to be a more pragmatic approach to this EV revolution in the Asian context, and then we will conclude. So, beginning with the fundamentals. For this, I think a good place to start is rewinding the clock, going back 150 years and talking quite broadly about electrification with the aid of these 2 images. So here on the left, you can see a gasoline iron. On the right, you see an electric vehicle. So why was this the case? My theory is, at the time, both gasoline technologies and electric technologies were discovered. Electricity is from the 18th century, but it was really in the 19th century where electricity distribution was introduced. And so with that, energy became useful for machines. But this electricity was not well distributed. The grid didn't exist, and the first commercial power plant you can see here was Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, which opened in 1882, and it was initially built to power 400 lamps. And this here used coal to power a steam engine, to power a dynamo, so it was kind of a hybrid electric engine. And this electricity generated wasn't available to households, and it really wasn't needed. People didn't refrigerate their stuff, their food back then. But there was a lot of blue and white collar workers, and they liked their nicely ironed shirts. So they used gasoline for their irons, which you could buy in a convenience store. So it was a convenient fuel to have. And then over time, electricity generation, it was increased and distribution was expanded, but it could only still be accessed in a limited number of centralized locations in the city. And the EV charging stations that existed were mostly found in big vehicle workshops, normally in the city center, where the wealthy car owners would go and charge their vehicles at night. So it really wasn't a scalable solution until Mr. Ford came along with his Model T, which was a petrol car. And this was built on highly efficient assembly lines. And he drove down the cost of car ownership and made a car that was accessible for both the urban and the rural dwellers, because petrol could more easily and affordably be made available in these rural communities. And so with this, the transition to petrol-powered vehicles and the internal combustion engine really began and made a lot of progress very quickly. But meanwhile, in the cities, through Edison also, the energy grids were being expanded, and households and domestic appliances like irons started to become electric, which is an interesting history in itself. But what it tells us is that it's not so much about the machines, but it's about the distribution of power. But of course, our machines or the engines or the motors within these machines are relevant. And the reasons why we want to electrify is really the superiority of the electric motor over the internal combustion engine. And we'll now sort of deep dive and look at some of the different factors. And the first reason for the superiority is, well, one, the number of components. So here you can see on the left, the internal combustion engine powertrain. It has 1,400 components. While on the right, we have the battery electric vehicle, the BEV, with only 200 components. So it's a much more simple assembly. And with that, you also have much less complex production supply chains. The next reason, and the main reason, is really energy efficiency. If we're to test both of these engines in a controlled environment, we can very quickly see that the electric energy, the electric engine, the motor, transforms the input energy 3 times better into kinetic energy, into motion, than a petrol engine would. So it's 3 times more efficient. But in the real world, the electric engine is much more efficient, upwards of 10 times. And that's because the ICE engine, it wastes a tremendous amount of energy just starting and stopping and idling, which is really illustrated in these 2 different graphs. So here you can see on the x-axis, we have revolutions per minute. And on the y-axis, we have torque and power. And the ICE engine, what you see on the left, it needs enough fuel combustion to just move the engine pistons to create enough revolutions to overcome the internal friction of all the different engine components to get movement. So you don't really get much movement below 700 revolutions per minute. And you really don't get significant torque until around 1,000 revolutions per minute. So you start to work the engine quite hard, but it doesn't convert into motion. So with that, there are huge energy losses. And these engines, they only reach a point of efficiency around 2,000 and 2,500 revolutions per minute. So huge energy losses unless you're driving at the highest point of efficiency. And still there's quite high energy losses. Meanwhile, on the right, we have the battery electric vehicles, which have very few components, very little engine friction, and, well, motor friction. And so with very little energy input, they can generate torque and motion, and the work that they put out is quite steady. So whether you're going fast or slow, the electric motor is very, very efficient. And so the EVs have efficiencies ranging anywhere from 70 to 95%. So even if we were to ignore the climate change dimension, there is a very strong rationale for transitioning to these electric vehicles. And there's many ways you can illustrate this. Here you can also see the losses of the internal combustion engine, 68 to 72%, versus how much energy is converted to the wheels, 16 to 25. And the battery electric vehicle, again, you can see far fewer losses. And if we include regenerative braking, we have upwards of 90% efficiencies, which is great. So it's a far superior engine or motor. But of course, we need to look at the bigger picture and consider how the electricity, the energy generated, how the energy is generated at the source. And as you know, electricity is really generated in many places from the burning of fossil fuels, 63% globally. And with that, we also have big energy losses attributed with converting fossil fuels to electricity. And we also have indirect vehicle emissions. So a coal fire plant, which we see here, for example, is only 38% efficient. And this is something that often gets pointed out to EV drivers. And it's a valid point. And until we transition to renewable energy production, this needs to be factored in the equation. And just to sum this up, if we look at the energy efficiency more holistically, you can see that an ICE vehicle, if you factor fuel processing and transport and use in vehicles, you lose 80% of your energy. While for a battery electric vehicle, say a private car, you have a 65% loss. So the battery electric vehicle is 15% more efficient. So it's really only marginally better if your grid is a fossil fuel based grid. But of course, our grids are improving, and these improvements will become significant, or the decarbonization potential will become more significant in the future. But there are a few places where there is huge potential already today. One of these is the country of Laos, where I'm very fortunate to work, where we have 99% renewable energy coming from hydroelectric power. And this is also a country where they have low foreign exchange reserves. And if you go to Laos, I'm not sure what the situation is like today, but on my previous visits last year, 2 years back, you would always see long queues outside of petrol stations because there wasn't enough cash to import fuel, and it drove the costs up. And this made electrification much more attractive. So Laos is a perfect country for electrification. And if you go there today, you'll see a surprising amount of electric vehicles. The BRT, which hasn't been completed yet, will have 50 electric buses, which is in part thanks to ADB. The high-speed rail, also a great electric piece of infrastructure. And we are currently working on a cross-border cable car between Laos and Thailand, also an electric project. And Laos is a perfect example of a country that can quickly decarbonize and embrace electrification. But fortunately, Laos is not alone. You have other countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, where we can really decarbonize significantly. And then the other countries, they are greening their grids. So the relative potential of decarbonization is growing. But it's still better to drive an electric vehicle. There's fewer losses, but we do still need to work across different sectors and make big improvements all around. Okay, so we spoke about motors, and of course, these are only useful when they have access to energy. And this energy comes from or is stored in the batteries, which are essentially the containers where chemical energy is turned into electrical, into motion. And just to refresh you on how that looks in a vehicle, if we take the Tesla Model S, for example, the battery is essentially made up of, well, the battery pack is made up of cells. There you have different variations, but a lot of the vehicles, they have what looks like AA batteries. And these cells, they get arranged in modules. The Model S has 4 different modules with a total of 7,920 cells. And then these get assembled into a pack, which can weigh up to half a ton in the case of the Model S. And this gets placed in the underbelly of the vehicle. So there's a lot of batteries in a vehicle. It can be up to 50% of the weight or even 50% of the cost of the vehicle. And these batteries are made from minerals and precious metals. And they're very complex and they're expensive, and they depend on very complex mining and complex global supply chains. So when we think of EVs, we do need to think of the batteries and their life cycle. First, we need to produce the batteries. And given the many different minerals, this is quite a complex and dirty process. And this process itself contributes to almost 50% of the CO2 emissions of the entire life cycle. Then these batteries, they need to be used in the vehicles for X amount of years. And as you know from your smartphone, they degrade over time, they lose their efficacy. And eventually the batteries, they become no longer useful as stores of energy for vehicles, which is when they need to be reused, repurposed, and eventually and hopefully recycled. And the topic of recycling is a very big topic. And I understand there will be future webinars that talk about this. It's extremely important. And you'll see why here, using the research of Volkswagen, where they compare the emissions of a diesel Golf versus an EV Golf. And you can see here, in the production phase, you have 29 grams of CO2 per kilometer, while for the electric Golf, you almost have double the carbon emissions in the production phase. So very carbon intensive to make EVs. But then if we look at the use phase, the EV only has about half the emissions. And then when you net it, the electric vehicle is marginally better, but this doesn't factor recycling. So I couldn't find figures for the footprint of recycling batteries. I think that's something that still needs to be developed further and figured out, but it's an important factor that needs to be addressed because these batteries are messy, they're dirty, they're poisonous. And this is a problem we already have with all our different electric appliances like our phones. And it seems like EV is just going to exacerbate this issue. But fortunately, the recycling of batteries is making big improvements and it is proving to be bankable. So I think this is, there's huge potential to invest in projects that increase the battery recycling capacity. And I hope ADB can help fill this gap. And we need to do this if we're very serious about decarbonization. And I think we also need to be more pragmatic. And we need to take into account all that I've presented and develop EV policies and approaches that factor all these negative externalities and come up with low carbon intensive solutions. And a good place to start here is perhaps by applying the avoid, shift, improve framework. So maybe avoid by minimizing the use of batteries. And we can do this first, not by driving in the first place, but in the context of the electric vehicles, by reducing the vehicle weight, the vehicle speed, and the range. We also, as we spoke about, need to shift to cleaner energy sources. And we really need to improve our battery technologies, our recycling, and the management of our batteries. And we also need to give consideration to the different vehicle types we want to electrify and how we prioritize these. And you can see here 3 different vehicle types. I think we should talk about buses separately because if they are planned accordingly and they have high ridership, they are absolutely worthy of electrification. But what I think is more comparable is small electric cars with 2 and 3 wheelers. And I don't have time to go into the depths of all these numbers, but if you look at the weight of the battery and the range, for example, a small electric car, significantly smaller than the Tesla Model S, has around 160 kilos of battery for a 400-kilometer range. While an electric tuk-tuk, for example, for 200 kilometers of range has a 16-kilo battery. And so for the equivalent range, it would be 32 kgs. And the cost is about 1/10 of the cost. And the mobility potential is quite similar, at least in the urban context. So when you look at it like that, light electric vehicles make a huge amount of sense. They're very well adapted for short trips, especially 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. With 1 wheel at the front, you can navigate the streets far better than a 4-wheeler car. You also only need around 1/10 or 1/5 the battery requirements, depending on the vehicle type. And if you have less batteries, you have less waste and you have less of a footprint. And then another big benefit of these vehicles is because you have light batteries, say 16 kilos per battery or sometimes less, the potential for swappability also increases. And battery swapping is a fantastic solution in the context of ensuring your vehicle is always charged and helps you avoid some of the long charging times with heavier vehicles. So we can look at it like this. One small battery electric vehicle can equal 5 three-wheelers or 10 two-wheelers. And so the mobility potential with light electric vehicles is significantly more than a small private electric vehicle. Okay, and a note also on charging. That's obviously something very important because these vehicles and these batteries only become useful once they are charged. And there's different ways we can charge EVs. You are familiar with all the ways from your domestic life, from the charging of your different appliances, be it your smartphone, which you slowly charge overnight, your toaster, which you plug into the grid. You may have a camera or a power tool where you swap out the battery, and that has its advantages. And then you have fast charging or opportunity charging, like this iron here. I've never seen one of these, but supposedly they exist. And these are all technologies that we also see in the world of transport. So all the different vehicles can be charged in different ways, and each have their relative advantages. If we look at buses, wired electric buses are a fantastic solution, but obviously you need all the hardware, which is very costly, and they can only operate in fixed routes, but you don't need big battery packs, which is great. Battery swapping for buses is very impractical. It's not a great solution. Opportunity charging is great, and we're getting better at doing it, but it has huge hardware and infrastructure requirements to have the facilities to quickly charge these buses. And that's very important when we draft policy and pick and choose which kind of vehicles we want to prioritize. So buses, again, they're seen more as a public utility, so they're quite different. But if we look again at small cars, private cars versus 2 and 3-wheelers, for the charging of a small car, if you want to charge it slowly, you need at least 10 kilowatts and 45 amps, which in Asia is not possible. I checked in the Philippines, and you don't have the ampage in most homes or in any homes to charge a small electric vehicle without blowing the fuse and without it being a fire risk. And you need to install big installations to make that possible. And that's slow charging. Fast charging, you need at least 150 kilowatts, which is a huge draw on the grid. It's an immense amount of power, and you could charge a car quickly, or you could power a factory. So it's very expensive, and it serves its purpose. But if we then compare it to what we can get out of a light vehicle, where you don't really need fast charging, because slow charging is fast because the battery packs are so small. And these are the kinds of vehicles you can charge at home in a normal outlet. And the benefit, again, is that you can swap the batteries in these vehicles, much like you could carry petrol in a bottle. You can swap out these batteries. And when we make a comparison, for the equivalent of one fast charger, say 150 kilowatts, you could have 100 simultaneous batteries charged for light electric vehicles, which can serve far more than 100 vehicles, because some vehicles will have batteries. They'll be using the batteries while they're in motion, and they'll come and they'll swap. So for one fast charger, which is sometimes used by a fancy car that needs a quick charge, you could instead service upwards of 300 light electric vehicles. So just to start wrapping up, I hope you can start to really just see the strategic benefits of light electric vehicles from a weight, a cost, a carbonization or decarbonization point of view. And I think, and I hope you agree that they should be a greater policy priority, because as of now, they really aren't. In Cambodia, I am based in Cambodia. I should have mentioned that because I've spoken quite a bit about Cambodia. You get a 50% import duty tax break for fancy Tesla. And so what we're doing through the policy here is we're essentially subsidizing the rich who can already afford these nice cars. Meanwhile, there's no tax breaks for all these different vehicles. And fortunately, because of their natural advantage, there's still an uptake. And if you look at the images here, you see we have shared light electric mopeds with battery swapping. We have electric tuk-tuks, and they're used for the movement of people and goods. We have electric utility vehicles, And here also on the right, we have probably the most common type of EV in Cambodia, probably also Laos and Vietnam. And this isn't even a license plate vehicle. And the vehicles you see here are very sustainable. They're cheap, they're convenient, they're space efficient, and they're all unsubsidized. And if we subsidize them, we could rapidly increase their relative share. And that could go a very long way in terms of decarbonization. So this takes me to my last slides. And there is huge potential, not just in Cambodia. There is huge potential in ASEAN, the region I work in, to transition the existing light vehicles to light electric vehicles. Huge potential in Vietnam, where 90%, 95% of vehicles are light. Laos 86, Cambodia 83, etc. Then in the broader Asian countries or Asia region, Asia Pacific region, Nepal, huge potential. India, significant potential. And where in those cities and countries where there isn't a high share of light electric vehicles, these are vehicle types and fleet types that can and should be introduced. A lot of the cargo could be, at least for first and last mile, put into electric vehicles. So there's a lot of business opportunities to create new services. So if we're serious about decarbonization, at least in the context of urban mobility, policy and project finance needs to, I believe, better promote light electric vehicles. And of course, we still need to continue promoting mass transit and active mobility and find ways to complement these with light electric vehicles. So I'll leave it here. I hope it didn't sound too much like a rant. I'm very, very passionate about getting the best outcomes possible from this mobility revolution. And I suppose really the decisions we make today will have a long-lasting legacy. So let's be pragmatic and let's make good decisions. Thank you. So while the questions are coming in, do feel free to reach out. My mandate is to do capacity building around this and many other topics. It's also to develop projects, and we do also need to identify different funding sources and mechanisms to make our projects a reality, or at least to scale them up. So I hope we can, or I see strong potential for mutually beneficial relationships here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Conrad. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I think you've given us a really solid foundation into the world of e-mobility there, and covered a lot of ground. I thought the angle you brought on light electric mobility was really interesting as well. A really great perspective. We are a little light on time, as you'll appreciate. That we'll try and keep the Q&A short. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is in relation to the ASI framework. So in the ASI framework, do you feel it is appropriate to include an enabling factor where institutional readiness is critical in implementing EVs? I don't know if you've got a perspective on that one, Conrad.
What is implied by enabling factor? An enabling. And
it's appropriate to include an enabling factor where institutional readiness is critical in implementing EVs. I don't know if Moshi, if you want to come in and clarify that one. And if we can open Moshi's mic up. Maybe not. We'll jump onto the next question, Corey. So light electric vehicles come with a price in terms of safety and quality of life. A BRT vehicle carries 150 passengers. Putting 150 small vehicles in its place may not be the best option for a city. It is a debatable question whether ADB should be promoting small electric vehicles. So I guess that's in the relationship between what you prioritize in a transport system and the balance between public transport, light electric vehicles and other modes as well.
Yes, no, that's a very valid and a very important question. And the solution, the BRT solution, is a fantastic piece of infrastructure to introduce and electrify, and spatially it's far less hungry than big fleets of light electric vehicles. So in a context where there is a viable corridor to put in a BRT, that is a much better mobility solution to introduce. Where we could explore opportunities is how we can improve the first and last mile to and from the BRT stations by using light electric vehicles, say a shared electric moped service. We could expand the station threshold and increase the accessibility, and people could use these light electric vehicles to interchange onto BRT buses and corridors. And I don't think only focusing on light electric vehicles is the solution. Absolutely not. We need a much more holistic approach. And maybe part of my thinking is overly focused on the Cambodian context, where we don't have mass transit. We do have a lot of light electric vehicles which exist and serve as the public transport. And I could and should, in this kind of presentation, better create and better allude to the potential link between mass transit and light electric vehicles.
Okay, thank you, Conrad. I'm conscious of time, and we've got questions flowing in, which is great. I'll take one from Verania. So, considering the socio-environmental risk from critical material mining for battery and e-waste, do you see the policy for standardizing green batteries to be feasible?
If I'm honest, I don't know enough about that side of electric mobility. I haven't come across anything that indicates we can create green batteries. Obviously, there's probably better places to source the raw materials from, and whether or not we can create green batteries, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. And it's a good question. Hopefully we can make significant improvements in the fundamental technology or the battery technologies and find alternatives to lithium ion batteries. But that seems unlikely at the moment, but I'm sure a lot of research is happening behind closed doors. So hopefully.
Fantastic, thanks, Conrad. And it's pointing towards that end of life being a critical element to this as well. Okay, we'll take one final question. So it's a Phnom Penh City. The government plans to update urban transport master plan. Current master plan has no e-mobility elements. What is your suggestion to promote e-mobility in the master plan development process? And Daisuke says may contact you later.
Please do. I have no agency in the Phnom Penh master plan, and it should absolutely be factored, because the public transport system here is not a formal public transport system. It's very much two-wheeler and tuk-tuk based. And we have a lot of interesting startups launching great products here, but they're not getting the support they need. And unfortunately, many are facing challenges. And how we can include that in the master plan, let's all sit together. There is a interministerial steering committee, and let's raise the profile of these vehicle types and try to create better balanced policies and master plans that focus less on heavy private electric vehicles and more on light electric vehicles, and not forget the significant potential of public mass transit and active mobility, which needs to all be addressed in one singular master plan.
Thank you, Conrad. We have got some further questions. I think the best way to address those is maybe to pick them up afterwards, and maybe we can circulate some responses around the group. But we are a little bit over. So at this point, I would like to draw this to a close. Thank you for your time, Conrad. I think that was really fantastic presentation. You covered a lot of ground there, and to thank all of our participants as well for joining the webinar, the first webinar in the series. Hopefully, we'll see you again in the following webinars to come. Our next one is on the 4th of October, and it's Moshe Mahmood from ITP will be presenting on developing an EV policy framework. So we very much look forward to that one. But thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Conrad.